She was looking to the left, with the pale sunlight through the window illuminating her pale skin. It softly touched the defined contours of her cheekbone, her jaw, her nose. There was something about the smile just starting or just fading. And her eyes, all the brightness in her eyes when she'd come into the studio had crystallized into this picture. There was something else in her eyes, something he couldn't make out. It seemed to be at odds with the smile. Or was it? He was not, by his own admission, very good at understanding what he thought of as the fairer sex, but he was good at his profession, his photographs. But he still puzzled over this one. Usually neither his customers nor his photographs were so enigmatic. "I have a beautiful photograph of you, miss," he offered, "but I will need to retake it." The lady with the immaculately styled dark brown curls and beautiful bone structure turned to him as if out of a dream. It had been a dream. Her life, of late, it had been a dream. Something Katie had said that she was deserving of, and she, Linda, dared to believe it. Since the dance, yes, the dance where she worried about what she should wear, Katie had loaned her a dress that Katie said complimented her hazel eyes, which she thought were the colour of mud, but Katie shushed her when she said that out loud, so now she just thought it silently. Lovely Katie, adventurous, outgoing Katie, her best friend in school. Katie even had a job, a secretary in an office, and her own digs. She still lived at home with her father, her loving and protective father. When she felt kind towards him, she thought of him as protective. When she felt less kind, she thought of him as overbearing and restrictive. She felt alone in their big, empty house, even when the servants were there, and even when he was there, sometimes even when he was in the same room. Katie had managed to persuade him at last to allow Linda to go to dances. Now the war was over and the place wasn't full of Yanks, as he called them. Katie had promised to look after her. Her father had looked sternly over his glasses and told Linda to let Katie look after her, not to lose sight of her and do as she says. And this dance, Katie in her blue dress and light brown low curls, Linda in the pale green dress and high dark brown curls, both with pink flowers on their dresses. They looked so alike, they looked like sisters. Unless you looked very closely and saw that Linda wore beautiful silk stockings. Katie's seam was drawn with an eyebrow pencil. Linda had been to a few of these now and was trying to get better at them, trying to accept invitations to dance, but often just blurted, "No, thank you," as a reflex action before she could get her mind into gear to accept. Katie had no such trouble, and if they were allowed, she would have pulled her onto the dance floor herself. It may not have seemed like it to outsiders, but their friendship was actually quite balanced. They each gave what they could to the other. Katie gave her energy, her time, her encouragement. Linda made sure that Katie came for meals in her big house, bought an extra winter coat which she gave to Katie, even shoes once, saying she'd bought a second pair by mistake and couldn't return them. Katie gave Linda a slice of emotional life. Linda gave Katie the means to enjoy it. Linda always made sure that the support was not overt to save Katie's pride. "That man over there is looking at you," said Katie. Linda looked. She didn't ever feel that men looked at her, although of course they did. "No, you're mistaken," she replied, while she turned to where Katie's eyes looked. There was a man there. Smart, dark brown hair, very handsome, with intense eyes. He couldn't possibly be staring at her. He started walking over. To Linda's total mortification, Katie took a step towards him just as he was approaching and said, "If she says no, don't listen. She actually does want to dance." Then she turned to the stupefied Linda and waved "Ta-ta" and walked away. Linda wanted the ground to swallow her up. Her eyes must have been like saucers. He looked at her, a little shocked, and said, "Nice friend," and laughed warmly. There was something about his laugh and his manner that made her warm, although she couldn't stop her face from being shocked. "Your eyes are very wide," he said. And then he added, "They're beautiful." Linda at last turned away and felt her face blush. She smiled despite herself. To her dismay, she felt her heart was pounding. If she spoke, she was afraid he would hear it. He smiled, and as he did, he looked down and turned his head slightly at an angle. She saw shyness there, saw vulnerability. It must have taken him a lot for him to walk up and talk to her. She softened, smiling slightly, and he looked up again and looked straight into her eyes. From that moment, she was lost. She thought about that moment for days afterwards, for weeks. Through the whole merry night, she could see nothing but his eyes and his face, and see that he smiled just for her. She felt his arms around her during the slow dances, and her hand in hers and on her waist in the faster ones. The evening was a blur, a beautiful, intense and heart-beating wild blur. But that moment, that split-second moment, seemed to last and last and last. His skin smelled fresh with Pear's soap, and when they were in the close dances, almost an embrace, when she could feel the heat of his body against her, she thought, she knew, she had never been this warm before. Never truly warm until now, this night, with this man. Over the days and weeks that followed, she saw him every single day. His name was Tom, looking for the right job since coming back from the front. He'd previously been a baker, he told her, but the bakery had been bombed, so he was taking the opportunity to review what he wanted to do. His father wanted him to follow in his footsteps, to be a solicitor, but Tom wasn't sure. Fathers can be like that, Linda said. They always try to do their best, but sometimes it's not actually the best, is it? He looked down at her as they walked along the river and smiled that shy smile again. Down, with a slightly tilted head. "You always understand," he said. "You know exactly what it's like. I don't need to explain anything to you." She felt so warm inside. It was astonishing how much they had in common. Then he spoke hesitantly, as if into the air. "My darling Linda, I hope you know that I'm totally in love with you." She stopped dead and let go of his arm. He turned to look at her and then rushed to her, wiping her face with his hands first of all and then reaching for his handkerchief. She choked through her sobs. "Please don't, darling Tom, please don't." "Why?" he said, wiping her face and then clasping her face in his hands and turning it up to him. "Why, my darling, why?" Still she choked. "Please don't say that unless you truly mean it." He laughed, and she pulled away, and then he pulled her back. It almost looked like a tussle, until he spoke very softly to her. "I mean every word." And she cried and went limp in his arms for a few moments until she gathered herself again. "Oh, Tom," she said while she was wiping her face with his handkerchief, "I love you too." "Then in that case," he said, suddenly backing away and looking at her, bending down on one knee with his hat in his hand, "would you make me the happiest man in England by marrying me?" Time just stopped for Linda. She had wanted to hear those words for weeks, but hadn't let herself believe she deserved such happiness. Now she actually heard the words. She wasn't sure if she was dreaming. She wanted to check. She wanted to laugh with the nerves that enveloped her. She wanted to ask him to please stop joking, but when she looked at his face, searched his face. She saw he meant what he said. Yes, she had let herself fantasize about him being a father with his daughter on his knee and young Thomas playing football in the garden, and she had seen the church in her mind and her flowers and imagined saying "I do," and imagined him putting the ring on her finger and the bells ringing out. And then in their later years she'd seen him with a pipe and grey in his hair, reading the paper while the kettle whistled. Felt like hours had elapsed while so much went on inside her, and she was here, and before her was the man that she adored. "Yes," she said simply, her voice sounding small and far away. He rushed up and hugged her, picking her up right there, picking her up off her feet on the path. Katie was overjoyed when Linda told her, but then being practical kicked in. "What are you going to tell your father?" "Yes, well, I was rather hoping that you might be able to help." "Help how?" said Katie, sipping the tea that the housekeeper had made for them. "What does he think of Tom?" Then she saw Linda's sheepish look. "Oh no, Linda, have you not introduced them?" Linda shook her head. "There never seemed the right time, and Father wouldn't understand that Tom is deciding his future, looking at what profession he might go into. He wouldn't understand that Tom isn't working at the moment. I wanted Tom to get a job and be more stable before I introduce them. You know what he's like. It's the first thing he'll ask." "Yes, I do know. And he's right," said Katie sensibly. "It's not as if he's not going to get work. It's just that he doesn't have work right now," explained Linda, feeling very protective over her future husband. Then she thought about that for a minute, and she stopped and smiled to herself. "Oh, good grief, girl," said Katie, chuckling and shaking her head. "I've never seen you like this. You're stopping and mooning over him constantly. You need to be practical for a second." Linda looked crestfallen, but nodded. "So, what money do you have?" "Of my own, very little. Father manages all that. I have a monthly allowance from him." "Well, that's not going to get you very far, is it?" Katie paced. "Well, you'll just have to wait then, won't you?" She looked at Linda, who was already shaking her head. "I love him, Katie. I want to be with him. I'm sick of living this cold life in this cold house with my cold father. I want to start my life. I want my life to be with him." "Well, what are the options then?" asked Katie, with more than a little exasperation, spreading her hands in front of her and then putting them on her hips. Linda looked at her and laughed. "You look like my mother." Linda smiled. Katie laughed a little. "I wish she was still here. She would talk some sense into you." "I'm not even sure I remember her that very well," Linda said with such sadness. "But I think she would want me to be happy." "Yes, I think you're right." Katie sat down next to Linda and patted her arm. "So, the next thing we have to do is work out how we can get some money." "What do you mean?" asked Linda, not really understanding. "You don't want to introduce Tom to your father, but you want to be with Tom, so it sounds like you want to go and get married as soon as possible, correct?" "Yes," said Linda, worried where this was going. "So it follows that you need some money and somewhere to go until Tom gets a job and your father calms down and welcomes you both back." "Oh, gosh, I really hadn't thought of all of this," said Linda, feeling quite cold. "Doesn't Tom have an aunt somewhere?" "In France, yes." "Well, you can go and stay there then, yes?" "I suppose." "So it's just the money then." Katie seemed pleased with herself, hands on her hips and pacing again. She turned again to Linda. "Is there money in the house?" "No, not much. Some, but we'll need more than there is here. Okay, so what's here that you can sell? Oh, I couldn't possibly. Something small that your dad wouldn't notice was missing, but valuable enough to get you some starter money. There's nothing, said Linda. It won't work. Katie stopped and stared intently at Linda. What? Asked Linda. Your mum's jewellery. Linda almost screamed. No, I couldn't. I just couldn't. Just don't. It would break my heart. Katie stopped, sat down next to Linda again. You said yourself she would want you to be happy. You don't wear her jewellery. You're not stealing from your dad. It is actually yours. You're never going to wear it, are you? No, but then it's doing no good where it is. Put it to good use. Your mum would be proud of you taking the initiative and starting your life with her help, her blessing. But it means so much to me. It's all I have of her, said Linda with such sadness. But it's not her, is it? It's just sentimental. I don't know why you didn't get rid of it years ago, she added. Tell you what, why not pawn it? That way you can get it back afterwards. When you're back in good old Blighty again and your dad has calmed down. He still need never know. Pawn it? I wouldn't have a clue about how, said Linda. Do you want me to help you? I've pawned things before. I know a good place where they'll give you a decent amount for it. Would you? Could you? Of course. Shall we go together? Linda looked a little grey. I'm not sure I can. Do you want me to do this for you? Linda flung her arms around her friend. Thank you, she said into her shoulder. I don't know what I'd do without you. Well, said Katie with a laugh, you'll have to do without me for a while, won't you? You'll be in France and I'll be here. But when you're in love, you have to leave and start your new life, don't you? Linda nodded softly. Katie had explained to Linda about travel papers and that she needed a photograph for the documents. Linda bought the tickets, which Tom was holding on to, and Katie had the jewellery transferred into a travel case to go to the pawn shop. She was due to meet them in the tea room with the lace curtains in Stafford Street, once she had her photograph. It was a beautiful dream, an exciting, nerve-wracking and slightly scary dream. But she was ready to start her new life. She was looking at the camera as she thought of it. Mrs. Tom Hodgson. The man had asked her several times to stop smiling as she sat in front of the camera, and at last, to try and gain composure, she looked out of the window. Oh, pawn shop, she noticed. I wonder if it's the one that Katie's using. Wouldn't it be funny if it was? Oh, look, there's someone who looks like Katie. But she's arm in arm with a man who looks like Tom. They look so in love. And they turn and kiss in the street, something she would never do. Oh, it really does look like Katie. And really very strikingly like Tom. Her ears, her head, her heart were all throbbing. The heat rising in her body was almost too much to bear. She'd been like that for some time. Someone was talking. The man taking the photograph. He'd taken it and gone into another room and come back with the proof. What was he saying? Retake what? He seemed to be waiting for her to respond, looking at her expectantly. He was showing her the picture, her own picture. The picture that was so clearly showing her world dissolving, crumbling, crashing around her. The picture that showed her eyes so full of sadness, shock, betrayal, that showed Her smile, her bright smile, a rosy, amazing dream future fading into nothing, as nothing remained of her dreams, her fantasy, her friend, her future husband. "I'm sorry. I've made a mistake," she muttered, abruptly standing and walking swiftly out into the street, leaving him holding the picture. She was hot and stumbling and fell into the wooden side panel of a shop window. Passers-by started staring. She couldn't have that. She suddenly found herself on a bus, the rhythm of the engine and the noise cutting through her dreamlike state, her nightmare state. She was frantically reliving all the moments of the past few weeks for a sign, anything, that things weren't exactly how they had seemed at the time. But no, there was no clue, except at the end. Katie had known Tom had an aunt. She had let Katie talk her into pawning her mother's jewellery, which she now had no means of retrieving. And then Linda realised Katie had actually been talking about herself in their embrace. Katie, the one she trusted so implicitly, was the one who betrayed her fragile little heart the most. "You'll have to do without me for a while, won't you? When you're in love, you have to leave and start your new life, don't you?"